I was on spring break vacation when Dave Bangert was scheduled to speak in March, and Roy Johnson had secured him, and he was unable to keep that commitment. I almost came home from Florida to hear Dave Bangert, but when I realized I was program chair in May, I thought that I had still 2 openings at that time, and thought that I could make amends for missing in March. I heard Dave Bangert at Westminster Village 2 weeks ago Monday for 1 hour and a quarter. And he was terrific, and I still think had some gas in the tank. But let me just say that Dave Bangert is Opinions page editor and columnist. I don't know if all of you knew that editor title, Opinions page editor of the journal Courier. He has been in our community 26 years. His picture, and even up close, looks a lot younger than that, perhaps. But, and he's been around newspapers since high school, and that's all I'm going to say, because he really likes a question and answer period. And that will be the bulk of the meeting, but I want him also to introduce himself to you, because I really didn't know him that well at Westminster when I heard him a couple of weeks ago, apart from the words on the page. So Dave Bangert is our speaker.
Well, thanks for having me. Can you hear me? Is this on all right? I am Dave Bangert. I work at the Journal and Courier. I have been in town since 1989. A little bit of background about me. I grew up in suburban St. Louis, a town called Florissant. Who here has heard of Ferguson? A couple people? Yeah, Ferguson, Florissant was my school district, so I was right next door to that. I loved where I grew up. I went to the University of Colorado. I wound up at University of Colorado because I wanted to go skiing, and I did a lot of skiing. I was not the greatest student, but I was okay. I started in newspapers, as you heard, when I was in high school. I liked to write. I, again, was not good at math. I wasn't good at a lot of things. But I had a teacher named Doug Lane who saw that I could write and said, you need to come take my journalism class. And for me, journalism at that time meant getting to write record reviews and movie reviews and stuff like that. And he started teaching me about who, what, where, when, why, and how. And the biggest thing was being able to go up to people and ask questions that they didn't want you to ask. And when you're in high school and you're 16 and 17 years old, the kids can push you into lockers. So I learned pretty quickly about where my lines were. It's a little different now. People I ask questions who don't want to be asked don't push me into anything. They have other ways of punishing. But for the most part, a lot of what I do is about trust. A lot of what I do is about being honest, being fair, being and pushing where it needs to be pushed. That's my big thing. When I graduated from University of Colorado, I ended up in Lawrence, Kansas. I worked at a paper called the Journal World, owned by the Simons family. They still own it. It's one of the few private companies you'll find around. They made it big in the cable company world. They were 30 miles from Kansas City, and so it made a lot of money in the cable industry, and so they can continue to fund their newspaper world. I was there for 3 years, and I came here on January 1st, 1989. Lived down on Wabash Avenue. When I first came here, my first house was at 7-Eleven, still there. Barely. That house is barely still there, but I lived right across the street from what was the fire station. On one side, I could see St. Anne's when they had Thursday night and Sunday masses, and then also the soup kitchen. I saw all that action. And then off to my left, at a corner when I come home and sit outside with my dog, was Gage's. How many of you guys remember Gage's? Yes. The big song in 1989 was Wild Thing by Tone Loc. And I would hear that 3 times an hour through the water lines and the sewer lines straight into my house. I always figured it was one of the, when I first moved to Wabash Avenue, everybody kind of stared at me at work saying, really? You're moving down to the avenue. And I didn't know any different. I thought that it was a cheap house, and obviously there was a reason why it was a cheap house. But it was one of the safest neighborhoods I've ever been to because the cops were always across the street escorting, and they were never bad things. It was always escorting unwanted guests. I could see it in the blotter every night when I would go to work and go check the jail logs, unwanted guests. I knew what times they were because I was out front watching them being escorted out. I came here as a city hall reporter, and what that meant for me at the time, I think Jim Reilly was in his 4th term at the time, maybe his 5th. I can't remember exactly. I covered city government. I covered county government. I covered police beat. I covered courts. Whatever they asked me to do, I did. I moved from there. I did some music writing for a while. Did features writing for a couple of years. Wound up coming back and doing projects. Editing, which I really loved because I get a lot of time to do projects, writing about neighborhood problems or whatever it happened to be. We did a huge package on shaken infant. Ended up getting some laws changed back in the 90s. After that, I became opinions page editor about the time that Bill Clinton was being impeached, so that was fairly interesting. And I did that for about 7 or 8 years. Then was moved over. I was asked to take over the city desk, and I did that for 6 or 7 years. And then Michael Davis, who was my previous boss, one day said, "We want to make you a columnist. We want you to do that, and we're going to have you write twice a week, and you also get to run the opinions page." So one of the things I do with the opinions page is I take care of all the letters to the editor, which is still one of my favorite parts of the paper. One of the parts that I think that is a lost. Is quickly becoming lost. How many people here take the physical paper?
Yeah.
Hey, quite a few. How many people look online ever? How about daily? See, and I said this when I was at Westminster too. Yeah. If I went to, let's say what's the 40 and under club at the Greater Lafayette Commerce? I can't think of the name of it. Tippy Connect. If I went to Tippy Connect, and these are people who are cut into town, businessmen and businesswomen, and people who run organizations and all the rest of it, the hands that go up for that question would be exactly opposite. Exactly opposite. We don't take the paper. And what I like about the letters to the editor and reading them is, unlike Facebook, you don't get to choose who you're going to read that day. You can skip over things. But it's going to be a true sense of left and right and middle, and you're forced to kind of read what is out there. And by forced, I mean if you allow yourself to be forced to do it. Whereas on Facebook, you get to choose your friends, and they tend to like the same things you like. So if you watch Fox News all the time, you're going to see a lot of Fox-related kind of things. If you tend to be an MSNBC watcher, you're going to see a lot of that kind of thing. When I read the letters to the editor, I talk to almost everyone who sends one. Everybody wants to fight or debate or whatever. And for me, it's just about, I want to get your opinion in the paper. That's what I'm about. As for column writing, I was Michael Davis when he asked me to do it. I said, "So what would you like me to write about? What am I? Is it supposed to be what is it supposed to be?" He said, "I want you to go out and break news sometimes, but put context to stories that we're reporting now. What is going on in the community that you think can use more than a typical reporter who's going to go out, talk to the mayor, talk to somebody else about their new trash can lids or whatever it is? What can you do to spin this into some kind of context?" And so that's what I've tried to do. Whether it's successful or not, I leave that up to everybody else. But I have a pretty free rein on what I want to cover. So I do enjoy that part of the job. There is some stress in trying to find out what those things can be. So I may spend the day in juvenile court and tell stories about why it's so hard to be a CASA, one of the volunteers who follow kids through the court system. These are kids who have no control for why they're in the court system. And these volunteers track them from beginning to end, and spending a day in court and really seeing how screwed up these kids' lives can be. And it is amazing what that can be. Today, I'll be, after I leave here, I'll probably be over on campus and talking about the tuition freeze and talking about how that's become the calling card for Mitch Daniels and whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. As the father of an 8th grader, it's aces. I love that. As someone who's neighbors with people who work at Purdue and have questions about, so who's paying the bills, I wonder about that too. So there's a lot of give and take. So what I try to do is try to give some of that give and take. A little bit more about me before I start taking questions. I have a wife. We live and a daughter who's in 8th grade at Tecumseh. We live just a mile off of downtown at the top of, we're about 3 blocks in from St. Mary's. And yes, I did find a dead body 2 weeks ago. And no, I would not recommend that for anyone. But sometimes the news comes to me. That's a little bit about me, and what I'd like to do is just open it up for what you'd like to know, because I've got plenty of stories that could go forever, and you'd all be bored.
Yeah, David, be sure and repeat the questions so that everybody can know what the discussion is.
I can do that.
Yep.
Hi, Dave. You've covered through several articles the community of choice, first the report and then the ongoing discussions. Could you touch on that a little bit as to the feeling you've gotten from various constituency groups around town? And then at some point today, secondly, with the new 231 bypass and the proposal about State Street, in your discussions with Purdue, is Purdue going to be an active partner in some of the development other than just the physical plant development, but other terms and other aspects of the community?
The question was, I've covered a lot about community of choice in the last 3 or 4 years, and some thoughts on that, and then also whether Purdue will be active in 231 State Street development, correct?
Yeah.
Community of choice, I think, was a godsend for me when they came and decided, when Chamber of Commerce or the Greater Lafayette Commerce decided to ask questions that I tried to sum up at the very beginning as, what the hell is wrong with this place? That was the essential question that I heard them saying, what's wrong with this place and what can we do to change it? Some of the answers they came up with, I don't know, are viable or right, but a lot of it I think is in the asking. And to me, that was a great stepping off point, to being able to have an excuse to say, so what is wrong with this place? And can we ever be Madison, Wisconsin? And do we want to be Madison, Wisconsin? And what do we want to be if we don't want to be Madison, Wisconsin? And it's interesting, the hands in this room, again, with the newspaper question, would probably be exactly opposite if I went and talked to the graduate students at Purdue, for example. And I have talked to them about that. They see this as a completely different thing. They see this as a worn-out community. They see it as a place to study and then leave. Not everybody, but that's kind of a general consensus that comes. And so the question is, so how do you do that? And I think the State Street project, is everybody here familiar with the State Street project? Just a little bit. West Lafayette wants to change, when West Lafayette got State Street, which was State Road 26, back from the state, they decided, well, if we're going to have it, we'll go ahead and redesign it, make it only two-way. Purdue wants more traffic off campus, so they're going to build these ring roads and all the rest of it. And they want to do more development. I thought it was a huge deal when Mayor Dennis convinced Purdue to be annexed. And I thought it was a huge deal when Mitch Daniels convinced his people that this was a good deal for them, and that going halvesies on State Street project was something that would benefit Purdue. Purdue sees itself as being not just the university in kind of that red brick confines that they've always been during the Beering years, for example, where it was just really self-contained. They see it as a college community, and how can we be more of a college community like Madison, Wisconsin? Do I think they'll continue to do that? I think that there's a reason why John Dennis wants to get it done very quickly before Mitch Daniels leaves, because the next president at Purdue could be a completely different game, and it always is a different game. that's one thing we'll see. I think it's a great thing. I hope it's a great thing. What else can I answer?
Do you have any restrictions on what you write from the Gannett Corporation or from the publisher? I think it's Mr. Witt, is it, the main guy?
Yeah, the question is, do I have any restrictions from Gannett or from he's my editor, Howard Witt. We don't have a publisher anymore. We now have a general manager who's off-site that we see on a regular basis, but she works out of Muncie at one of our sister papers. I probably have more restrictions from Howard than I would have from Gannett. People used to ask me all the time when I was writing regular editorials, when do you take your phone call from Reston, Virginia to find out what you're going to write? And one thing about Gannett is we have not, it is a corporate model for media, but they're not interested in running our day-to-day operation. They're worried more about bottom line, and they give us some guidance on, here's what initiatives are going on. But I have never had anybody call me up and say, you should write this or write that. And one thing I always pointed out was, go look at the paper's endorsements across the company, and there were anywhere from 80 to close to 100 since I've been in the company, at various times. Go see who they endorse for president. And that should give you a pretty good idea of what they're writing. And you'll see that they get split up all over the board. If I saw 90 papers all endorse Al Gore, for example, you would have had a good sense of what was going on. But it was just a big mixed bag. But Howard does watch what I write. I know that there are things that I probably self-edit myself more than anything else. And if I'm going to run something that he's going to have to answer for, or I assume he's going to have to answer for, I usually go to him and say, here's what I plan to do. And we talk over what that might be.
Could you expand on your thoughts on the lions and tigers and bears, oh my, and why the vandalism occurs, and what can we do?
So the question is what thoughts on the vandalism on the Bears project downtown, and the art things. I just looked up in 2003 when we did the first one.
Yeah.
There were the hogs,
Yeah.
and it was only a day before one of them was plucked up and never came back. It was one that I think it was Vinton School, or one of the schools had done. It was called Patriotic. And somebody wrote me, and she said she had thought that somebody had bragged about throwing it over the bridge and into the Wabash. I don't know if that's true or not, but it never did show up. So if it went over the Wabash, it was like now it might be in Covington and beyond. Well, much farther than that since 2003.
St. Louis.
Maybe. Maybe. I think it just speaks to a lot of traffic. I think those things, I think what you can look at is if you look at other pieces of art that are downtown, permanent pieces, have not been messed with, generally. Very rarely do we see any kind of vandalism on those kinds of things. I think there's something about having a temporary piece that make them more compelling. I think we're probably also seeing some kids climbing on them and breaking pieces. There could be a lot of things. I thought that Stephen Vaughn, who made the one that I wrote about the other day, had a great quote when he said, inebriated and bored are a bad combination for public art. And I can imagine people coming out of D.T. Kirby's and Spurlock's and Brewing Company, and name the bars down that way, who just walked down the street and did something. I don't know if it speaks to that we're bad or anything. It's just too bad that we can't get beyond that kind of thing. Yes?
On the back page of yesterday's paper, there's like 7 individuals from Chicago living here, selling drugs near the schools. And I'm sure there's a tremendous amount of excellent police work to get that done. It seems like we were getting the migration coming from Chicago down here more often as you read the paper. How do you feel about that, and how do you feel about writing articles about, supporting our police officers for everything they're doing?
So the question is, what do I think about the story about the criminals being arrested for, what, that was for drugs, right?
Yeah, drug trafficking.
And I can't remember if they were all from Chicago.
All of them except one from West Lafayette.
Okay, and what about the migration from Chicago? And I don't know about the migration from Chicago. I know we did a huge package on that, and I was not in on that part of that story. But the question there, a lot of people have said, well, you say that there's no migration from Chicago, and I suggest that you need to read that package again. The story was mainly about, did people in the projects that came down a few years ago, were they given vouchers and told go to Lafayette? And that turned out not to be true. We were hearing the mayors say those kinds of things. We were hearing judges say those kinds of things. And the question wasn't that there was no migration. If you read the second day of that package, there actually was a lot of talk about where our growth is coming. I would suggest that that's not all of a Chicago or region question. I mean, the dead body I found was from Muncie. I see the woman who held up Kathy's Candies the other day is a Lafayette native. There's a lot of that. I think what we're talking about is poverty. I think we're talking about drugs and having a lot of opportunity to steal and do whatever they're going to do. I think that's one thing that we're dealing with it as a community. I won't speak expertly on that. I'm just talking about what I feel in my neighborhood and what I see in the paper. Do I think it's all from Chicago or a Chicago influence? I think that's probably a smaller piece than we let on, because I see a lot of people, relatives of people who when I first came to town, played softball with these people. These are kids of theirs, cousins of theirs. I don't think it's a migration question. I may be wrong, but that's my take. Yes.
What's kept you in Lafayette?
What's kept me in Lafayette? I probably would have a hard time getting another job. Family for one. Family has kept me here. I married Carol in 1992. She had just come back here in 1989 or 1988. A couple months before I did. She's an archaeologist by trade, by school. And when Graham Rudman budget ran out, her position was eliminated when she was working in New Mexico. And so she came back, and her dad is Bob Kriebel, and he said, come down, we'll get you a job. There may be a job open at the paper. And so she got on part-time, and that afternoon was put on full-time because someone had left. So we met at the paper. So family's been a reason we stuck around in a lot of ways. And no real need to go anywhere else. I've advanced in-house, and I have a job now that would be hard to replace in another place. Being able to write and being able to track the changes that have happened here. So does that mean we'll stay here forever? You know, we like warm weather too, but that's one of the reasons I stayed. And no one's come knocking. It's not like people want. And I think it's a hard job to get.
Concerning letters to the editor, how many do you get usually in a day? And are they edited or are they pretty much verbatim?
The question is, how many letters do we get a day, and are they edited or are they verbatim? You see either online or in print about 80 to 90% of what we receive. When I had this job the first time in 1998, I was receiving about a dozen a day, which would be a typical day. Now I see 4 or 5, and we go through droughts. Like this would be a drought period because Purdue is letting out. There's a lot of people concentrating on end of the year school things. So it's dropped because people have other outlets. They have Facebook, they have Twitter, they have other ways to get their opinions out to people besides the paper. We used to be the only game in town, and we understand that we're not that anymore. We don't try to pretend we are. But when they come, as long as they meet 250 words or fewer, their facts are straight. Just because you say, I think something is a fact, that doesn't make it your opinion. The facts still need to line up. And it's not libelous or offensive in any way. We run them. And I do edit for clarity, and that means just making sure nouns and verbs agree. Those kinds of things. I don't rewrite, I don't rearrange, I don't do anything like that. I fix spelling, that kind of thing. And if there are bigger problems, I send them back and say, you've said X and that's just not true, and how can we get around this?
Do you always call the writer?
I don't call every time, but we do converse back and forth on email or a phone call. And I do double check phone numbers to make sure that they line up with who they are, or I confirm in some way that they are who they are. So, yes.
On Sundays, in Sunday's newspaper, there's always what I think is a funny cartoon from Dave Sattler. Does he work with you on those, or does he create those basically on his own?
Does Dave Sattler create the cartoons on the opinions page on Sunday on his own, or does he work with me? Dave is about, who here knows Dave Sattler? Dave's about as independent as they come. Bob Kriebel would have told you that same thing 20, 30 years ago. Dave likes to have his own ideas. I vet all of them. I send some of them back saying, let's touch something up, or let's change an idea a little bit. As much as I like to have Dave call me and say, give me 3 or 4 topics, he usually comes up with his own and sends it in. And I reject probably 2 or 3 a year. And I know that they make his, when he comes to these kinds of things, he always puts up the ones that get rejected. So if you ever see them, ask him about why I rejected something or why I didn't run something. But generally, I have no, there's a reason why he's been doing that for us since he was in high school. I still have one up on the wall where it shows Purdue Pete standing, the old Purdue Pete, standing next to Neil Armstrong, standing on the moon, and it's My Hero or something like that. So he's been doing it since the late 60s for us. Yes.
How much do the, cultural values of the community affect what you write about or how you write?
How much do the cultural values of the community affect how I write or what I write? I think the cultural values of the community are everything I write.
Yeah.
I would say that. Does that mean I'm in step with the the community's cultural values? That not necessarily. Sometimes I'm going to challenge those values. I'll tell you that coming out in support of same-sex marriage was something that I believe is in step with the cultural values of this community, but only recently. I can tell you that coming out in favor of, let's stay on that topic, sexual orientation in the Human Relations Ordinance in Lafayette, when we fought about this in 1993 for the first time. Some of the nastiest meetings I've ever been to at the Long Center because they were so heavily done. The worst slurs, the worst anger I've ever seen in this community. And I bring that up with every boss that comes afterwards. They'll say something like, this has to be the worst this community's ever seen. And I always say, we need to go back to 1993. And then again in 1996, when it was tried to be repealed. That was the worst in terms of that. But am I on the same page with everybody in the community? I don't think that's even possible. Because I'll give you an example. Mitch Daniels has been pure gold for a columnist in this community. When he was named president at Purdue, the fact that a lot of people were mad about it was just, pure gold for me. That just gave me a lot of ground. And he turns out to be a pretty good sport about that kind of thing and saying, okay, so here's my side. of that. But one thing I always tell people is no matter what I write about Mitch Daniels, no matter what it is, if you could have a 1 to 10, I love Mitch Daniels 10 and I hate Mitch Daniels 1. And let's say one time I write a 4 and one time I write an 8 and one time I write a 2, depending on the topic, where I'm going to land. I can never love him or hate him enough in one article. I can guarantee you that if I said that he should be fired, someone will call and say, I can't believe you didn't say he should be drawn and quartered. I mean, they will be that mad about what it is. And if I say that this is a great idea and all the rest of it, and let's say it's an 8 on a 10, one of those 10 people are going to call me and say, figures you're picking on Mitch Daniels again. I guess you got to sell newspapers, or whatever it is. But I think that I look at a lot of different aspects of the cultural values of this community, whether it's religious, whether it's arts, whether it's how we treat our kids, all those how our schools deal with school reform and whether it's needed or not needed. I don't think I'm ever going to be on the same page with everyone, but I am going to try to reflect kind of a pulse of what's out there. I take it kind of like a movie reviewer. There are actually, I spent a lot of time in record stores when I was a kid and then later on through. I read a lot of music reviews of people I hated. I just could not stand their view on music, and I could always read it and go the opposite direction of what they said. But I used them as a barometer. I mean, they were a good compass almost. If they pointed east, I'm going to at least want to go northwest. And so that's how I try to be too. I try to be consistent and challenge and be consistent in my challenges so people feel that they can base their own views on me. And I'm happy with Letters to the Other. I'm happy to run ones that say that Dave Bangert, what a dummy. So that's all the time.
Over the years, I've read some books that were compilations of columns that people had written, and it gives you a really good perspective on history and on culture of the times that they wrote those columns. And I wonder if you're preparing something like that for Lafayette.
First off, am I thinking about compiling columns into some kind of book? I don't think there would be a market for it, number one, quite honestly. And the other thing is, what I do tends to be so in the moment. I don't really write timeless pieces. I mean, I go back and read sometimes and think, oh, I remember that issue, and I'm surprised I said that, or that's really good, or boy, I really missed the boat on whatever it is. But I'm not sure there's a market for that, like the old Bob Greene columns or anything like that. So.
One more question. Yes, please.
The Lafayette Leader, back as a competitor, always was kind of known for school items that was going on in the community, 4-H band, fires, and so on. Is there a possibility that the JNC could do more of that? Because these kids are our future leaders.
The question is, the Lafayette Leader used to do a lot of things on schools and their accomplishments, right? Mm-hmm. And what's going on. We do, our coverage has changed through the years as we've become leaner. And a lot of that goes on. I think we cover 27 school districts, or actually 26 school districts and 27 high schools because there are 2 in TSC. That gets tough to start grabbing everything that happens. I think you could go to Jeff or go to Harrison or go to Westside and fill the papers with what they're doing.
And we would love that.
Well, the problem is, where do you
as
stop?
a consumer?
The problem is with that is those tend to be things that the people who would really love it already know, or would say, well, I'm not interested in Westside, I wish you would do McCutcheon. And I wish you would do Twin Lakes, or I wish you would do Burnett Creek Elementary. I mean, you can really parse that down. And so I know our sports guys have a hard time with that, is getting phone calls, figures you covered CC when they lost. Well, they don't go and say, well, I'm going to go cover Central Catholic when they're going to lose. They go and they pick the best games they can get and figure that most people want to read about. And then put the rest of it, in, as much as they can on the second page and ag it. So, but that's a good point. I mean, we could always have more good news. It's a matter of space and manpower. So, well, thanks everybody.
A terrific job. One question asked 2 weeks ago was interesting, I thought, is who determines where your writing goes in the paper? On page 1, or as one person suggested, it ought to be on the back page about 2 weeks ago. So who determines where your articles fit?
Well, the thing is, I write them and my bosses put them on the paper. It really is, I'm not in on the meetings. No. I used to be, but once I start writing the columns, I'm not. So if you don't like that it's on the front page, I'll give you a telephone number and you can make that phone.
I thought that was a good question, and I wanted you to know that. Appreciate, I think you'll read the paper, or somehow you're going to read it a little more because of Dave being here today. And our speaker last week, Tom Pearson, there's an article in the paper today that's just right up his alley when he was talking about the China Sea and the way China was taking islands that are emerging out of the water and making airports out of them or something so that they're China's. And it's a very good article. And I love when we're together and get some, I say, the programs at Kiwanis are worth the price of the meal and you eat free. I've said that for 51 years to potential Kiwanians. Also, there was an article in the Exponent last week about the 6 majors areas that this one student has, and I think that's one of the, and he's from Fort Wayne, and he was homeschooled through high school, but he went to IUPUY at Fort Wayne because he in high school had 3 levels of calculus and one beyond that. He came here as a math major. He's going to Stanford for his PhD, and what he wants to do is create robots that you can teach a language to and then learn to think. That's what his PhD goal is. I think it's a great article, and I've never known someone with 6 majors, and 2 of the 6 were with honors. So, hey, I love to read the paper, and sometimes I might say I get the Journal Courier because of Dave Bangert. I appreciate his being here today. Thank you very much. Next week, the program is by Tracy Dodds.
Thank you, sir.
A member of the Indiana Sports Writers Sportscasters Hall of Fame. And her title is No Women or Children in the Press Box. She was one of the first women ever to go into the locker rooms after football and basketball games. And she was, she covered the Milwaukee Bucks basketball team early in her life and persuaded the management to buy bathrobes for all members of the team. She's a hilarious speaker, a lot of comedy, and she's one of our top people in our community in terms of Sports Writers Hall of Fame. Her name is Tracy Dodds.